And while you do that, from the busy streets of New York, I will provide you with deeper insights on the developments through the course of the day in the U.S.
And I will be here at the WION headquarters, getting you all the action from the universe of sport. All that you need to know about your favorite teams and players, right here.
The show that keeps you ahead of the global curve. A conversation you'd want to be a part of.
A place where news becomes an engaging exchange.
We bring you stories that impact your present.
This is World DNA.
Join the conversation.
Vielleicht nur als imposant.
Hi everyone, welcome to this WION News Desk from New York City. I'm your host, Susan Tehrani. First, let's get you up to speed with this hour's headlines. Ahead of the Ukraine peace summit, Putin lays down conditions for talks, says Russia would cease fire if Ukraine drops NATO ambitions and withdraws forces from 4 Ukrainian regions claimed by Moscow. G7 leaders commit to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. According to a draft statement from the summit, where they agreed a new $50 billion loan for Kyiv. Meanwhile, G7 leaders also call out China for dangerous incursions in the South China Sea amid fears of escalation in the contested Asia-Pacific region. Cyril Ramaphosa is set for re-election as South Africa's president after the country's second biggest party, Democratic Alliance, says it reached an agreement with ANC to form a multi-party coalition government. In Greece, the country's prime minister reshuffles his government following disappointing results for his right-wing New Democracy Party in last week's European Parliament elections. Here in the United States, forecasters warn Floridians to prepare for additional flash flooding after a tropical disturbance dumped as much as 50 centimeters of rainfall in the southern parts of the state. G7 leaders are turning their attention to migration on the second day of the summit in Italy. The leaders plan to discuss ways to combat human trafficking and increase investment in countries from where migrants start out. This is a crucial issue for the Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, who is pushing Europe to help her curb illegal flows from Africa and has launched a flagship plan to boost development in the continent to tackle the root cause of the departures. But the key session in the summit comes before lunch, focusing on fair trade with China, the world's second largest economy. The issue ranged from security in the Asia Pacific to how best protect their industries while avoiding an outright trade war with Beijing, notably on green technology. The Japanese Prime Minister will likely lead the talks, which would also address North Korea and territorial disputes between China and its neighbors. In addition, the group of 7 rich democracies will be seeking a common response to China's alleged support of Russia's military expansion, which Washington says is fueling the war in Ukraine. The second day of the summit also coincides with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz's birthday. So ahead of the resumption of meetings, G7 leaders sang happy birthday to him, as U.S. President Joe Biden called on everyone to sing to the chancellor, saying, "It's the tradition of the Biden family. You've got to sing happy birthday on the birthday." The leaders then broke out into the song, to the delight of Scholz, who was beaming throughout the celebration. Take a look.
It's his birthday.
Yes.
There we go. It's the tradition of the Biden family. Got to sing happy birthday on the birthday. So
Happy birthday
to
you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you, Olaf. Happy birthday to you.
Pope Francis briefed the G7 summit in southern Italy, the first head of Catholic Church to take part in the meeting of rich nations.
Sarà una lunga giornata, lei lo sa. Abbastanza lunga. Però bella. Mi fa tanto piacere, un grande regalo questa tua presenza. Grazie. Veramente. Sono molto contento.
Also in Italy, on the sidelines of the G7 meeting, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi held a series of bilateral meetings with world leaders. Prime Minister Modi met French President Emmanuel Macron on the sidelines of the G7 summit. The two leaders reviewed the India-France relations and discussed cooperation in defense, nuclear, space, as well as connectivity. After his meeting with Macron, Prime Minister Modi held bilateral talks with UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. Both leaders reaffirmed their commitment to further strengthening the India-UK strategic partnership. Prime Minister Modi then went on to meet Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The two leaders exchanged views on the situation in Ukraine. Prime Minister Modi conveyed that New Delhi continues to encourage peaceful resolution of the conflict through dialogue and diplomacy. All right, for more, let's now go live to Voice of America's White House Bureau Chief, Patsy Widakuswamy in Puglia. Patsy, great to see you there. A key topic of discussion today at G7 is on AI ethics. That is led by Pope Francis. So why the Pope?
Yeah, this is a really interesting choice, especially because, Pope Francis himself, as you know, has been a victim of AI-generated memes. If you would recall, he was pictured in all these images where he was wearing an expensive designer jacket or riding motorcycles or DJing in a nightclub. So this is an interesting choice. Nevertheless, Pope Francis himself has come up with what is called the Rome Call for AI Ethics, essentially calling on governments and businesses to follow principles of ethics for AI, including transparency and accountability, to ensure that AI development becomes something that would be useful for human dignity rather than a replacement for them. So this is a session that was going on earlier today for the leaders, and they are expected to reaffirm the commitment towards these principles. This is something that the leaders have set up beginning at the G7 summit in Hiroshima, Japan last year, and we expect it to feature prominently at the Leaders Summit today, at the communique today.
And Patsy, have leaders agreed on what to do to push back against China's economic practices? There was a lot of talk regarding that.
Yeah, this is definitely something that there are differences, among the G7 members. As we know, President Biden really wants the group to be forward-leaning on this subject, to confront China on its economic practices that they say is harmful to trade and development around the world, pushing back against China's overcapacity flooding of electric vehicles and other sectors in green industries around the world that President Biden really wants to push again. And as you know, he has already slapped 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. And this is something followed by the EU that earlier this week announced tariffs for Chinese EVs also at 38%. But, there's differences because some of these leaders, particularly France and Germany, they have a much higher, much deeper trade ties with China, and they really want to avoid a trade war. So those issues are discussed, as well as China's support for Russia's industrial machine. This is something that President Biden highlighted himself last night at his joint press conference, saying that Russia may not be supplying weapons to China. China may not be supplying weapons to Russia. However, they are supplying the technology to produce these weapons. And this is something that President Biden wants to address. Another key issue is the Belt and Road Initiative that the West believes is creating what they call this debt trap diplomacy. They're trying to offer an alternative in the form of this partnership for a global infrastructure investment, $600 billion, the goal, private funding by 2027. We'll see how far along the group gets to that goal in their communique today. We know that the U.S. has so far fronted up about $60 billion of private investment, and the goal is for $200 billion for U.S. only in 2027. So those are like the key areas where the U.S. wants the G7 leaders to really push back hard on China on.
Okay, we'll see if they will agree or not. And finally, Patsy, can you give us a quick recap on what the leaders' positions are on Ukraine and Gaza?
Well, on Ukraine, you see a lot of support. I mean, the G7 basically announced that they will agree to this U.S. plan of providing $50 billion up front to Ukraine in the form of a loan that will be paid back using income from interest of the frozen Russian assets that are immobilized in Western financial institutions. There's about $280 billion of those assets, mostly in Belgium, in France, and in Germany. And it's estimated that the interest, about $3 billion or more per year, can be used to pay back for this $50 billion loan. This is a risky plan because of a number of issues. Number one, what are the legal implications of doing such a thing? I mean, this has been done before, for example, in Iraq when it invaded Kuwait, but there was a UN Security Council resolution to support that. And number two, what guarantees that the countries in the EU would continue to immobilize those loans for the duration that it takes to repay, will continue to immobilize the funds for the duration that it takes for the loan to be repaid. And what if interest rate falls? Nevertheless, President Biden was able to convince the G7 leaders to agree to the plan. There is still a lot of technical details to be negotiated and discussed, but they have agreed in principle. And of course, you also see the fact that President Biden yesterday signed a security deal with President Zelensky to guarantee the next 10 years of U.S. military support for Ukraine. So a lot of issues, a lot of focus on Ukraine. On Gaza, I think it's clear President Biden yesterday said that he was not confident that a ceasefire will happen anytime soon. He's putting the onus on Hamas to agree what has been offered. So those two issues are being discussed by leaders, and they will be affirming the principles of their support for a ceasefire in Gaza, as well as their resolve to support Ukraine. We shall see that in the upcoming communique.
Well, thank you so much for all of those updates. Patsy Widakuswara from Puglia, Italy, traveling with the U.S. President, VOA's White House Bureau Chief. Patsy, I'll talk to you soon. Thank you for that.
My pleasure.
Well, Western leaders are in Italy to explore ways to help Ukraine and punish Russia. We've talked about that. And ahead of the Swiss summit to forge peace in Ukraine, Moscow is closely watching all these developments. On the eve of the Switzerland conference, to which Russia has not been invited, President Vladimir Putin set out his recipe for peace, and his conditions are dramatically at odds with what Ukraine is demanding. The Russian president claims that Moscow will cease fire and enter peace talks if Ukraine drops its NATO ambitions. Putin also wants Kyiv to withdraw its forces from 4 Ukrainian regions claimed by Moscow. Further, he has called the Ukraine Peace Summit a distraction.
What the organizers of the meeting in Switzerland are proposing is another trick to distract everyone from the causes of the Ukrainian crisis, reverse cause and effect, and set the discussion on the wrong track.
In its third year of the war, Russia now controls nearly a fifth of Ukrainian territory. Ukraine says a lasting peace can only be based on the full withdrawal of Russian forces and the restoration of its territorial integrity. The weekend summit in Switzerland that will be attended by representatives